Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session, the final session into our inquiry into the licensing of taxis and private hire vehicles. This morning we'll be hearing from the Minister, Lilian Greenwood, as we examine the government's plans to introduce national minimum standards as well as other important issues we've heard about throughout this inquiry. So please could I ask you both to introduce yourselves, starting with our Minister.
So I'm Lilian Greenwood and I'm the Minister for Local Transport.
And I'm Liz Wilson. I'm Deputy Director of the Department of Transport with responsibility for accessibility and also for taxis and private hire vehicles.
Excellent. So thank you for coming. The laws that underpin taxi and private hire vehicle licensing date back, many of them to 1847, with a few slightly more recent adjustments, and 1976 was the other main one. So does the department believe that the legislative framework should now be updated or replaced with a new set of legislation that's more fit for modern times?
Well, thanks, Chair. I'm really glad to be here and having this discussion. I want to see the sector better regulated. I want the public to have a range of services that they can be confident are safe, accessible, available and affordable, whether that's in a taxi or a private hire vehicle. It's absolutely clear to everyone that the current legislation is archaic and fragmented. I absolutely wouldn't suggest otherwise, and it doesn't help to achieve the goals that we want. We have a decent functioning taxi and PHV sector, but it's despite the legislation rather than really because of it. And I think, the biggest strain on the regulation has come in the last 10 to 15 years. It's from the change that's been driven by, from obviously the adoption of new technology, but also the choices that passengers are making with an increasingly higher number of PHVs than taxis, and I think that has implications for the way that we regulate. And I think the reasons for wanting to do more, we know that anyone who is aware of this, that a small number of people in the sector played a role in the absolutely awful abuse of girls in our communities. It was a very small number and part of much wider failings in public protection that obviously extended far beyond taxi and PHV licensing. But obviously it was right that those failings in licensing were highlighted, and it's right that they were acted on. And I think much has changed since the J and KC reports, which looked at historic failings, and safety has improved. We don't want to demonise the trade or suggest otherwise. But I think, so although I think in any normal sense of the word taxis and private hire vehicles are now safe, I don't think we can be complacent, and I think there's still much that needs to change, and our focus is primarily on safety, particularly on safety and accessibility. The first step in this change, if Parliament agrees, is the introduction of national minimum standards, and you know that last week we started the consultation on changing responsibility for licensing. But I think there's a broad consensus that the legislative framework needs comprehensive reform. That was acknowledged when the last government asked the Law Commission to look at it, and then of course we had the Law Commission report, and then we had the Task and Finish group that the Chair and I are both very familiar with from previous life on the Select Committee. I think there's that consensus that it needs to change. I think exactly what needs to change, there's less not necessarily consensus about, and in many ways that's why I think this is a really useful process in helping us to come to a firm view about what that change should look like.
Thank you. In 2014, the Law Commission published a draft taxi and private hire services bill, which was sought to replace the current patchwork of legislation with a single regime for taxis and private hire vehicles. So is the department inclined to revisit any of that work?
Well, I think as we develop our proposals in the future, we absolutely want to draw on the work that the Law Commission and the Task and Finish group did. I think although it's now a little while ago, kind of coming up for 12 years ago. I think many of the issues that they identified and put forward suggestions around have not changed markedly, and so I think absolutely we'd want to look at those alongside, the work that the department has already done, particularly around statutory guidance and statutory and the best practice.
So not ruling out a fundamental revisit of the law, but that's down the line. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think I'd be very clear that I think there is a need for fundamental change to the regulations to put them all in a sensible place. It feels to me that, we've got the 1847 Act, we've got the 1976 Act, and then we've just got a series of sticking plasters, really, to try and make that legislation fit for purpose. And it would be far better to do a comprehensive reform and, start.
Okay, and we're going to come back to some of the detail of the implications of that hodgepodge through our questions. Scott.
Are we going to see that comprehensive review before the next election, though? It seems very unlikely.
I think this is something that we absolutely are focused on doing. Now, obviously, there's always competition for what goes into our legislative programme, because this government is ambitious about the things that we want to do. And you've seen it in our own department, is we've had an early focus on the rail system and on buses. But I would say this is a high priority, particularly for me. So.
Okay, so back to sticking plasters, if you don't mind me using your word there. You're consulting on national minimum standards. Why not just go for absolute standards? Because that would really raise the bar, wouldn't it?
I mean, I think it's a really important question. I think there are some areas of some areas that I don't think we would actually allow for any variation from. So when it comes to safeguarding and safety and actually accessibility, I think we want to set standards that it would be hard to see that could be improved on. So, for example, when it comes to safeguarding, we want every local authority to require PHV and taxi drivers to have an enhanced DBS check and to be checked against the adults and children's barring lists. That, for me, that is a minimum. It's also a maximum. There isn't any stronger regulation that you could have on that. I think, in the spirit of devolution, to just have absolute standards and not allow licensing authorities to have any variation or anything that takes into account their local circumstances, that doesn't feel in the spirit of devolution. But what I want to do is to use national minimum standards to kind of raise the bar, and actually to have a much more consistent set of standards across the entire country. But I think my view is I wouldn't want to necessarily rule out that local licensing authorities could have discretion to have additional things that meet their particular issues. And maybe an example might be, if you know that you've got a particular issue with air quality, is it reasonable to say we'd like we want a higher standard around the vehicles?
Okay, well, come
but
back.
I'm interested in the committee's views on that.
Come back to that. I guess, I'm sure you've been sitting and watching the recordings of our earlier meetings when we debated these issues. I'm sure you have. I'm sure you have. But you'll know that what's happening just now is people are shopping around to get cheaper licences or more relaxed licences. By setting minimum standards, that's just going to amplify that issue, isn't it? People are just going to search for where they can get a licence easiest. And that's not necessarily, I don't think it's at all in the best interest of consumers, is it?
So I think what's in the best interest...
you're aware of the issues.
Absolutely aware of the issues. And I think we would like to... I don't think that's a good situation. I don't want people to be shopping around for licences. I think I'd say two things. First is the idea of introducing national minimum standards. And partly that is because we wanted to act quickly, particularly in response to Baroness Casey's recommendations, and there was an opportune way to do that, is we want to be clear that everyone can know that when they take a taxi or PHV, that it is going to be safe and that it is going to be accessible. So I think it's about improving the standard everywhere, and that should lead to less inconsistency and less variation in standards across the country, because we already know actually that all local authorities tell us as a department, all 263, that they do require the highest standards for safeguarding. But, for example, when it comes to disability equality training, it's only something like 67% of local authorities that are making that a requirement. I think that's unacceptable. You should know that when you go to use one of these vehicles, that the people who are providing that service do know what's appropriate in order to meet the needs of disabled people. So that's an example of something where I think I would be committed to including that in the national minimum standards. But in the English Devolution Bill, we're taking the power to set national minimum standards. Obviously, we'd want to consult on what those national minimum standards should be, and some aspects will be controversial. I think we said in our written evidence that requiring CCTV at the moment, I think it's only 8% of local authorities require CCTV to be installed in private hire vehicles. I think there's certainly an argument to say that they protect drivers as well as protecting passengers, but they bring issues around privacy and around data protection. So that's an example of where I think there's an opportunity for us to take time to have a debate and a consultation and take different views into account and come into a consensus about what those national minimum standards should be. I don't know, Liz, if you wanted to.
No, I would agree. I think the aim of this is to try and improve consistency, to try and reduce the incentives for out of area working, because I think, as the Minister says, our starting point is that we would expect people to be licensing where they intend to work, and if the more standardised we can make this, the reduction in incentives there are to do otherwise. And I think particularly on safeguarding and safety, we want to see a much more consistent position that would eliminate the perceived need or the value in shopping around and looking elsewhere.
But realistically, Liz, it's great that you're expecting people to licence where they intend to work, but you could mandate that, and that would be better for everyone, wouldn't it?
I mean, there are different options that you could look at on this. So
that would be best for users, wouldn't it?
I think I don't know if we know that it would be at the moment. I think
Why
this is the thing we worked about.
Why expect it then?
So I think what we do think it would be better for consumers is people to license near where they live. I think the issue is about how you achieve that, and there are different options to do that. One of which is journey restrictions and out of area working restrictions. One is about consistency of standards and enforcement that would remove the incentive and the differentiation. And I think the question for us is which one of those options is the best one for passengers, people using the services, and for drivers and the sector as well, and finding that balance.
Okay, and in the letter to us, you said that you would continue to consider absolute standards. But realistically, that means we're going to go for minimum standards. We'll see how that works. And if there's still issues, you might come back to absolute.
Well, national minimum standards is what we're introducing in this current legislation to make what I think is a very valuable first step in tackling the issues that Baroness Casey identified. And certainly, in our discussions with her, she's been incredibly supportive, both of national minimum standards and of us changing the licensing level. So obviously we'd moved from having 260, if that were progressed, 263 local licensing areas with their own standards to only having a smaller number, around 70. That combined with national minimum standards, I think, will lead to a much greater consistency. As we've said in the earlier discussion, we are looking at comprehensive reform of the whole regulation. So this isn't the end. This isn't the end of the conversation.
And I guess you could raise the level of those minimum standards, so by de facto they would move towards absolute, So in terms of the standards, will you be looking at minimum English standards? English standards for drivers?
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. We already set out, I think in I can't remember if it's our statutory guidance or on our best practice guidance, that people should have a certain level of English. I think it's important for communicating with passengers, it's important for understanding safety information, I know local authorities have different ways in which they assess someone's English. Some local authorities do an English test. Some do it more as part of their assessment of someone's English through participating, for example, in disability equality training. I'd want to look at what's the best way to do that, but I think in answer to your question, I'm pretty clear that English should be a requirement.
But the level of that, you're not quite sure what the level of that will be yet, but there will be a requirement. Okay, so what about emissions then? So emissions is also linked, I guess, to vehicle age and also vehicle safety. So is this something you're looking at, emissions, in terms of minimum standards? Whereas you did mention that earlier. Where does that come in?
As a government, we already set standards for vehicle emissions to protect everyone who uses our roads. I think vehicle age, obviously, there's an issue around vehicle safety, so we require all vehicles on our roads to undergo an MOT test. I don't think it would be unreasonable to think that for taxis and PHVs, which are obviously doing a lot more mileage than ordinary most vehicles would be doing, and also that are obviously providing a service to the public, that we might require more frequent MOT tests, particularly for older vehicles. When it comes to whether we should, I'm not sure that I think we should have emissions as one of the national minimum standards. Obviously, the
equality is a huge issue in our towns and cities, though, isn't it? And you know, you appear a relatively fit and healthy person, but if you had a respiratory problem, it's probably something that's on your mind every day.
I absolutely agree that emissions is a big issue, particularly in our towns and cities. It's perhaps less of an issue for a taxi and PHV operating in a much more rural area. So that's where I think there's an argument for saying that if you are a licensing authority that is primarily looking after a city or urban area, that it's reasonable to include a requirement around the emission, the vehicles that you're operating. Maybe that wouldn't be so reasonable or feel so necessary if you're in a much more rural area. But I'm open to.
For instance, if there's a ULEZ, you'd expect taxis and private hire vehicles to be compliant with the ULEZ. So that that's an obvious example of where there might be an exception to the minimum standards, or whether it doesn't need to be because it's taken as read that taxis and it isn't actually taken as read, because if your vehicle's not compliant, you pay an additional charge. So I suppose that's where there might be a very strong incentive
for your taxi to comply with the
exactly. Sorry, Scotland.
Yeah, I guess local authorities could look at their air quality action plans. If that's what we have in Scotland, I don't know what the term is in England, and they could link taxi emissions to that. On age, though, in your own road safety plan last week, I'm sure you're talking about how technology in newer vehicles is going to be a benefit to us. So it does make sense to put an age limit on taxis, and that's one of the things we heard. I think people targeting licences, in particular local authorities, because they knew they could get their banger, if I could use that phrase, licence. Should you not be looking at vehicle age? And that is also a surrogate for emissions as well.
And I did wonder if that's why some local authorities were putting in a requirement around vehicle age. I think where there seems to be a slightly odd way of applying it is that some local authorities seem to have an age for first licensing that doesn't apply when you're renewing your licence. So theoretically, and Liz can correct me if I'm wrong, there are some local authorities where you would be able to renew your licence with a vehicle of a certain age, but you wouldn't be able to licence it for the first time for a vehicle as a certain age. And I'm not sure that makes sense. Liz, do you want to
I think that's absolutely right. It's one of the areas of greatest variability, I would say, and probably one of the areas that does prompt people to look around where they can licence in a different area. And there are licensing authorities where it's no older than 3 years, for example, but you can then license that vehicle for another 10. But if you came with a 5-year-old vehicle, you couldn't license it. And so I think that there is absolutely something for us to consider about how we measure the safety of a vehicle. And I think we need to make sure that we've got a lot of evidence, and this is why we want to consult on these standards to gather that evidence, so that passengers can feel wherever they're getting onto it, they know that it's at a base level of safety, that they can be confident regardless. It does seem slightly odd that they're actually, even in the same area, there could be one car that's 10 years old and a 4-year-old car that's been refused a licence.
I mean, I think the other thing to say is, of course, the higher that the more requirements we put in, the more cost we're putting into the system, and that doesn't come, that has consequences, doesn't it? Is we know that a lot of people rely on taxis and private hire vehicles, particularly people who perhaps don't, can't afford to have a car of their own, or disabled people who, wouldn't be able to drive, or even would be able to use public transport. And I don't want to make it unaffordable for them to use taxis and PHVs as well. So I think, we have to keep passengers in mind in all of this, as well as other players within the system.
It does feel like a real race to the bottom, though, the way the industry is working. I think, we heard from drivers about how their wages are really getting hammered down, and if the result of that is we've got older, more polluting, perhaps less safe vehicles on the road, I'm sure people are willing to pay a little bit more to have a cleaner, safer vehicle that they're travelling. I hope they are as well.
Well, so, that's certainly. Yeah. I think that's really interesting, because obviously it's my experience of using taxis and PHVs is that a lot of them are modern hybrid vehicles, and actually on certain apps, when you get your choice of vehicles that you're going to use, you get the option to take an electric vehicle rather than not, and it might come at a bit of a price point. So, the public are already making the choices, and perhaps sometimes it's for us to allow them to make the choice about what's affordable and what's their priority, rather than us saying this is the service that you have to have.
But of course, that consumer's making that choice, and it's other people that are breathing in the polluting air. Training, you've already said you'll cover training, and that'll cover accessibility, which is fantastic. What about turnaround time for licence applications? Is that likely to be mandated?
I mean, I think the power that's set out in the English Devolution Bill would give us the ability to put requirements on that. I'd be interested in the committee's view on that. I mean, obviously, there's a big incentive for local authorities to process licence applications in a timely fashion, particularly if you want people to licence with you rather than shopping somewhere else. I mean, I think, the impression I get is that part of the reason why people are licensing away from the area where they work is because they know that the turnaround times are quicker, as well as, obviously there's issues around licence fees as well. One of the potential advantages, we think, of moving from 263 licensing authorities to a smaller number is, the potential for economies of scale and for them to be more efficient in the way that they offer that.
Okay, last question is a quick one. Is any areas you're going to rule out in terms of minimum standards?
I don't think so. Okay. I think we're quite open to looking at, the views that people want to put forward.
Okay, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. The Department stated, and you've said as well this morning, Minister, that national minimum standards are an important first step to tackling some of the issues that have arisen from out-of-area working. Lots of contributions to our inquiry have suggested that national minimum standards would not be strong enough to do that, especially given that the means of enforcement could still be 200 miles away. If the goal is to disincentivise out-of-area working, I wondered if you could speak in more detail about how bringing about national minimum standards will achieve this.
So I think, I think as we've heard, is that some people are licensing with authorities away from where they intend to work because they can get licensed more quickly and more cheaply and start earning money to support their family. And we think that by making all local transport authorities responsible for licensing and having national minimum standards, it will reduce the differences between local authority areas, which reduces the incentive to license out of area if it's not significantly cheaper or faster, and is not sufficiently different from the licensing in your local area. It seems to me that there'll be less incentive. There'd be less incentive to do so.
Liz, did you have anything to add in response to that one?
No, I think I agree with what the Minister has just said. I think, and I'm sure we'll come to this, I don't think your point about enforcement is something that also needs to be looked at to make sure that when we bring the national minimum standards in, that we would do that alongside it. But I agree with what the Minister said on the incentives point.
Just following on from that, do you think that one of the places where this is happening a lot is in Wolverhampton? I just wondered if you think that that's a problem, given, for example, in the first half of 2024, over 8,000 licences were issued there to new drivers. Why do you think that's arisen? I think, Minister, actually you alluded to some of the reasons it might have done there. And could you speak a bit more about how government might resolve that?
I mean, certainly I met Wolverhampton very recently in the I can't remember now whether it was just before Christmas or just before Christmas, and frankly, talking to them, I think they were rather reluctant about the role that they'd ended up with. I don't think it was ever their intention to become the go-to licensing authority. Obviously, because and they don't have any choice. If someone turns up and asks to be licensed with Wolverhampton, if they meet the standards to be licensed in Wolverhampton, and I don't think the standards in Wolverhampton are significantly less. There's a bit of a myth out there that somehow they're cowboys, and I don't think that's at all fair. Then obviously they've got license there. They also, I think, probably partly as a result of that, and they've invested significantly in their digital systems, they've become very efficient at doing the process. And we know that there's quite a lot of variation in licence fees across the country. I think I asked the question of the team, and it runs from about £150 to about £300. So there is quite
Wolverhampton's
a bit of
lower,
variation.
And their turnaround is quicker.
And they're going to be, because they've invested in doing that. It's almost like kind of fulfilling, is that once you've kind of done all that, you're going to become you are going to become faster and more efficient. I don't think it's an ideal situation. I think we would want people to be licensing where they're intending to work, and that's why we've looked at these short-term measures in terms of national minimum standards and changing the level of the licensing authority, which I think will help. I don't think they're a panacea. I don't think they're a silver bullet. I think if we want to tackle that issue of people working away from where they live and operate, there's probably other action that we need to take. But I think it also brings other potential for other unintended consequences.
And just finally from me on this section, obviously you said that you want them to be licensed locally. It would be helpful then to maybe understand the department's view on giving combined authorities that option of ensuring that drivers' trips start or end within that area. I'd be interested to hear from Liz maybe about whether that's an option that the department's looked at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at the moment we're open to all options, and we've heard quite a lot through this evidence and elsewhere about this. I know TfL have talked about this for some time as well. So it's not something that we are ruling out at this stage. I think the concerns that we have, and I know that other witnesses have talked about the potential for empty miles, the potential for that to knock on to the prices, and to the Minister's point about particularly disabled people. We know that, I think Transport for All did a survey where it was talking about at least sort of 2/3 of disabled people, the cost of a taxi was a barrier for them, and we have to be really conscious about anything that might further exacerbate that problem. So it's something we want to look at that. There are other things we could also look at about asking people to licence within a distance of their home address, because most people do tend to work close to where they live. Lots of the people who are licensing through Wolverhampton and driving elsewhere live close to where they're driving. So we could look at that kind of thing. So restricting where you licence rather than where you drive, because I think we just want to make sure we've worked out what the unintended consequences for any action that we take might be, so that we don't store up a future problem on this.
Thank you. Baggy, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Just back to Wolverhampton, I think there's probably a question for Liz. The Minister's right, Wolverhampton made out to us when they gave evidence, I think it was their Chief Operating Officer, that they're a victim of the current system. I'm not quite as convinced, to be honest with you. I think that's probably a fair way of putting it. They could introduce a local knowledge test, for example, which would make a significant difference. 96%.
That would be against our statutory and our best practice guidance.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be illegal, would it? If it's a huge problem that they're making out is for them, they've got many levers that could rectify that problem for them if they were serious about doing it, is my point. Do you agree that their excuse for it being our guidance and DFT's sort of guidance is the problem, or do you think they could do more to rectify the situation themselves, even with current guidance?
I mean, I think that, could they introduce things that would create a barrier? They probably could. I think in doing that, though, there would be consequences elsewhere, because they would be moving away from best practice guidance, doing things that would impact legitimate local drivers. So, I mean, could they? Yes. Should they? I think is something to be debated by Wolverhampton, to work through what they think the balance of that is, and what the right solution for that would be.
And I rather suspect that the problem would just move somewhere else. When I look at some of the taxis the PHVs that are licensed in my local authority area that I see on our streets, it's clear that a lot of some licensed with Nottingham City Council, some licensed with other licensing authorities nearby other than Wolverhampton, and I think it would just end up moving the problem.
And we have seen that previously. Wolverhampton is the main one, but there have been other licensing authorities that have had a disproportionate number of people licensing with them historically.
I think one of the things that's quite interesting, if local authorities want to take action to discourage out-of-area licensing, is looking at what their own requirements are. I thought it was quite an interesting example that we had of Oldham, who kind of looked at, they were concerned about the number of their drivers who were licensing out of area, and they looked at their own requirements and identified some of them that they decided weren't really necessary for ensuring safety and accessibility. And after they effectively kind of reduced their requirements, they got more drivers licensing locally, but without impacting, input things that they'd identified as important around safety and accessibility.
Does that not drive lower standards then?
Well, it's about what's the necessary standards. What is the licensing authority there to do? Clearly, it's about ensuring that the public are safe and that they have a standard, a quality of service, and that they're not going to face discrimination. But are all the... To give you one example, is that there's one local authority that requires that PHV drivers wear shirt and trousers, that they're not allowed to drive in jeans or tracksuit bottoms. Right. Well, is that really a necessary requirement? Arguable. It's not something that's ever crossed my mind as a worry when I get
obviously
in the
taxi. In our evidence, we've had a whole series of different reasons, often by those who are not themselves drivers, saying why, giving lots of different reasons given for why drivers operate out of area, some of which, Wolverhampton being cost and speed of turnaround, although Wolverhampton appears to have challenges around enforcement. Others are around lower standards. Others other reasons have been given as well. So, but obviously, if the whole climate changes in terms of minimum standards, that may change. But there's some other areas that we'll want to look at around the implications and the changes of out of area working. And of course, both Oldham and Wolverhampton will not be licence authorities if your proposals go ahead anyway. Sorry, Lawrence, you wanted to come in with a supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and as with previous sessions, I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the fact I worked for the Minister between 2012 and 2016. Minister, I wanted to come back to something you said, which is I think that there's no evidence that Wolverhampton's standards are significantly lower than comparators. We heard from Wolverhampton that they do not, as a matter of policy, go beyond the minimum standards currently recommended by the department, and there's some evidence that other authorities have been unwilling to enforce higher discretionary standards because they fear that drivers in future will simply go to Wolverhampton or to other licensing authorities instead. And statistically, Wolverhampton has one of the very lowest rates of wheelchair accessible private hire vehicles licensed by that authority. Is that a concern that the department shares, that when you have dominant licensing authorities, that there tends to be a race to the bottom in terms of standards down to that minimum that the department establishes?
I mean, I don't think it's a good situation that so many drivers are licensing with Wolverhampton. I wouldn't want to give that impression. I think I'd got the impression in the broader, just from the conversations I have with colleagues who haven't looked into taxis and private hire, that perhaps Wolverhampton were being unfairly penalised as being very lax, whereas, you know, some of the things that they do around safeguarding are, you know, are very good. In for example, the daily checks against the national databases. And I am concerned about the potential for there to be, because of licensing shopping, that it does move to it can become a race to the bottom, and that is precisely why we want to introduce the national minimum standards to say, you know, we want to raise, you know, the rising tide to raise all boats, and to ensure there's a greater consistency, because, you know, things like safety, safeguarding, disability, equality, those should be non-negotiable, and that's why I want to make sure that those things are the same everywhere, irrespective of where the driver is licensed, irrespective of where you're using a taxi or private hire vehicle.
And we're coming on to accessible vehicles in a later question. Okay, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you've talked about the fact that the prices to get a licence are different across different authorities. Why doesn't the department just set a standard price?
So I think there's two reasons. So, I mean, obviously fees are determined by local authorities in order to them to be self-funding. I would recognise that the cost of operating in a local authority service is not uniform across the country. There will be variations, for example, in wage rates in different places. Not local authorities won't have, you know, exactly the same pay rates in different parts of the country. If I'm totally frank, there's also an issue that I have observed is that when we set a fee in government, there's a tendency for those fees to get stuck at a certain level and to not be reviewed in a timely way, because it becomes then a very political decision. So I'm slightly nervous about setting of national fees, and as I say, I'm not sure that it would necessarily. I think we might have to do something to kind of compensate areas where they've got higher costs. I mean, obviously you can recognise that pay rates are higher in London, so the cost of providing a taxi licensing service in terms of the people that you employ to do it is going to be higher in London than it would be in Nottingham. I don't know if, Liz, you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously it was something that the Law Commission looked at and suggested. I think one thing we would expect, though, is a more standardised set of requirements that people are having to go through might lead to a more standardised cost regime. The other thing is, as the Minister says, it's self-funding, it's about enforcement as well, and what we wouldn't want was be to inadvertently find that, you know, if costs go up and the price of it doesn't, that you know, restrict enforcement. So I think it's a decision to be sort of really thought through before we rushed into anything. But we, you know, I absolutely take the point that more consistency would help with the issue that we're facing.
Would you consider any form of sort of national band or cap with a bit of local flexibility that, you know, takes into account those different wage rates?
I mean, I'm open to considering that. I mean, I think the concerns that we've got are as Liz and I have set out, but certainly I'm not averse to looking at those sort of ideas.
Thank you. Baggy.
Okay, the department is consulting on moving responsibility of for taxi and private hire vehicles licensing to licensing local transport authorities, as the chair's just alluded to earlier on. What do you think will be achieved by doing this?
I think that there's two things. I think obviously by its nature, if we move from 263 to 70, there'll be a greater degree of consistency, because there'll just be, you know, fewer licensing authorities each approaching it in its own way. I think there is the potential for greater efficiency just by making the licensing authority, you know, it's a larger organisation. If we were to tackle issues around out of area working, or to look at different options around that, obviously it's easier if there are larger licensing areas and fewer of them than if you're working from 263. I think those the main advantages I see of moving. I mean, the other obvious thing is that local transport authorities are responsible for local transport plans and for thinking about transport in the round. That's where other aspects of transport are regulated and considered, and therefore, you know, taxis and private hire vehicles would be seen as part of their overall transport provision and network planning.
Yeah.
Don't know if, Liz, you wanted to add anything.
No, I completely agree with all of those points.
Alex?
So 2 follow-ups on that. Before you were talking about the fact that one set of standards might be very reasonable in an urban area and a different set of standards in a rural area. When we move from 263 to 70, we're going to have much larger areas that cover both urban and rural. How do you square that?
I agree that's a fair point.
Okay, and then my other question is, how is this going to work in practice? So presumably these powers pass, for example, to a mayoral strategic authority who set up a taxi licensing committee, I assume. Who would have the political control of that? Would the directly elected mayor be appointing the chair of that? Would it? How would that work in practice?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. It's something that we've talked about, because obviously TfL is the licensing authority for London. They don't, as I understand it, they don't have an elected licensing committee. They decide policy, and then the application of their licensing policy is delegated to officers. Now, in lots of local authorities, obviously the routine kind of issuing of licences, where there's no question, is already delegated to paid staff, and then perhaps those issues that require, a smaller number will go to a licensing committee for decision. So obviously in a mayoral authority, they would have to look at what's the appropriate way to do that, and I would imagine they might go down the same route as Transport for London have done.
So the concept would be that the mayor, the directly elected mayor, would be setting the political direction for how licensing
alongside the combined authority area.
Thank you.
Right, Steph.
Thank you. Just very briefly, before we move away from who licenses, and I'm sure colleagues will have perhaps even more pertinent questions about who actually enforces, has the department looked at the possibility of going a step further and exploring just a simple national licensing system?
It's not something that I've had a discussion about.
I think it's a good question on whether it is something that could be looked at nationally. I don't think we've looked at it in a huge amount of detail, but I think it is something that we could look at again in the round. I think the general view of this is taxis and private hire vehicles do tend to be operating that kind of first mile, last mile in local areas, and like plugging that in through to like the local transport authorities feels like the right kind of level for that to be working. But, you know, I recognise that there are other fit and proper person tests that are done nationally, so it's something that we could test against.
Elsie?
Yeah, just very briefly on this, sort of moving licensing from a local authority to strategic authority level, obviously it then becomes less local, there's less local knowledge. Surely that's what the opposite of what a government with a devolution agenda should be trying to achieve?
Look, I mean, let's not pretend that there's a sort of nothing's going to change option here, because in the context of local government reorganisation, there's already going to be change about what those in many places about what the licensing area the licensing area is. I think part of doing it at bringing it to a strategic level is just to make it more manageable and sensible for people on the ground. It's particularly if there's concerns about out of area working. I don't know, if you look at at Greater Manchester, is that obviously there are lots of boundaries between local authorities, that if you wanted people to work in Bolton but you wouldn't want them to be taking, you know, the same operator to be working in Rochdale or Burnley or you know, whatever it is. So I think there's a logic to actually moving to an authority that more reflects the sorts of journeys that people are taking.
Thank you. And Elsie again.
Yeah, thank you. So alongside moving responsibility for licensing, the department has said it's considering wider reform options on out-of-area working. Can you set out a bit more detail about what other options are being considered? And as well, will these options make enforcement action possible closer to home than it is currently?
So I think we've looked, I mean, obviously there are lots of different options around tackling out of area working. So, for example, that you could only pick up a fare in your area and take it somewhere else and do another one from wherever you were back into the area. I think as Liz said earlier, there are some disadvantages of making those sorts of restrictions. Certainly, operators tell us that they think that they wouldn't be able to operate in the way that they do if those sorts of requirements were put on. I think you can particularly see the problems that arise when someone's living close to the boundary. You know, you might live just inside Nottinghamshire, but your local taxi firm is in Leicestershire. It's a different local authority. It'd be different even if it went to strategic authority level, and therefore you wouldn't be able to use them to make your local, you know, perhaps some of your local journeys, and I think, you know, that's disadvantage. Obviously, you could have a lot more empty mileage, so if you do a trip from, I don't know, Nottingham to East Midlands Airport, you then wouldn't be able to pick someone up from East Midlands Airport and come to somewhere that was on the way back but outside of Nottingham, for instance. So then you've got quite a lot of journeys where a taxi is driving, or a taxi or private hire vehicle is driving around without anybody in it. It's not earning income, and it's, you know,
it used to happen before 2015, I think. The ABBA was the norm.
So we were less worried about, you know, carbon emissions and congestion and things. I mean, I think the other, and obviously one of the other issues is about there being sufficient service availability, particularly when you've got major events. Obviously, when there's a major event happening, particularly in, you know, your city or my city, is, you know, you'll get taxi drivers coming in and private hire vehicle drivers coming in to provide a service. And what we don't want is people to be in a position where, you know, they want to get home late at night often, they want to use a licensed vehicle, and there isn't availability. That you know, undermines what we're trying to do in terms of providing people with safe transport options. So I think those are some of the disadvantages of going down that route. As Liz said, we also considered, you know, should the requirement be to licence close to where you live, but without there being restrictions on where you can operate. I don't know, Liz, if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and the kind of the pros and cons we're thinking about in terms of the ABBA model. You know, you could also go to a proportion of journeys so that you could create a bit more flexibility, and then you could look at near where you live. I think the point you make about making these things enforceable is really key to our thinking as well. You know, an advantage to checking where someone lives is it's much simpler and easy to do at the point of licence giving, actually checking in on the journeys that every individual's making and making sure that they are abiding by the rules. And so the outcomes we're aiming to achieve are going to be achieved because people are doing it is much harder in a journey restriction environment than it is in a kind of close to where you live environment, or indeed if you did set the standards at such a level that people just didn't licence elsewhere because there was no point in doing so. You know, those things that are, you know, easier, I think, to then enforce.
That's helpful, thank you. And look, from speaking with trade unions and PHV drivers in my constituency, drivers are very open to displaying signage that's related to their local authority, but they often feel restricted by measures that compel them to display one sole operator, as they tell me that this limits working in a very saturated market. Would the department envisage local transport authorities adopting powers to require consistent branding or livery, so vehicles are clearly identifiable to passengers, or would a sort of preferred outcome be for a local authority signage to be displayed? Minister, I don't know if
I think I think there's the disadvantage of having local authorities demand a particular sort of branding is precisely because people often work for a number of operators, and therefore that you know, drivers might object to that. I think one of the other issues around private hire vehicles displaying, I mean, obviously taxis displaying, having a particular livery in their local authority, I think is probably commonplace. But for PHVs, is if you require a standard livery that makes it clear that something is a private hire vehicle, it does open up that possibility of people treating them like a taxi, if you see what I mean, and kind of approaching the vehicle and asking for a ride rather than which obviously wouldn't be appropriate because they need to be pre-booked. So I think those are disadvantages. I know I'm trying to remember which authority it was was it Oldham?
Yeah.
That has a sign which requires them to have signage on the door that says private hire vehicle for pre-booking only. That, you know, so I don't have a strong view on that, but I think those are some of the issues that we would want to consider.
You, Baggy. 9.
I'm next.
Traditional apps versus new or operators versus apps, should I say. Does the department believe that the current licensing conditions treat app-based platforms and traditional operators fairly, or does one face looser requirements than the other?
I mean, I think the requirements that we put on for licensing on drivers and operators are neutral, actually. I also kind of wonder whether is that distinction between app-based operators and traditional operators still is that still valid? I mean, I think in my own local authority of, I don't know, DG Cars, I've been using for donkey's years, is back in the day you would phone up and book one. Now they have an app that's very similar to other popular apps that might be out there. So I'm not sure there's that distinction is really quite as clear as it once was. But I don't think that we require different things of them in general. I don't know if, Liz, you wanted to...
No, I think the licensing regime is consistent on the things that are expected. I think the market has changed, and that, you know, for consumers, using apps has become more prevalent, and I'm sure that feels has made the market difficult and different for people who are not app based, and that there's greater competition. I don't think that's part of the licensing system, I would say.
Thank you. Elsie, did you have a couple of other questions about working conditions?
Yes,
yeah.
Just briefly. Are working conditions for drivers a concern for the department? And if so, what plans do you have to address this?
Well, obviously, I recognise that in the course of the inquiry, the committee have heard concerns around working conditions. And I know there was a suggestion that there was evidence that that drivers were sleeping in cars or even taking drugs to stay awake. And I know that the National Private Hire and Taxi Association submitted further evidence refuting those suggestions. So that's clearly... I mean, obviously, I would be extremely concerned if there was evidence of people... I wouldn't expect people to be acting in the way of either sleeping in their cab or taking drugs in order to try and keep themselves awake. We want people to be safe drivers. That'd be really worrying. I think, obviously, I want people to have good working conditions, and I want them to have working conditions that encourage safe practice. Issues around employment status don't really generally sit with my department. They would sit with the Department for Business and Trade, but I'd be very happy to look at the suggestions that the committee has and to talk to colleagues across government about those issues.
Jacob, you had a specific point that's come up to us
yes,
during
so
the inquiry.
This was about safety and distractions, and I'm sure that you've been in an Uber when a new ride has popped up, and it's quite distracting, I think, for the driver. In our evidence, Uber did say that they didn't think that was a problem, but I'm sure that from our own experience, you know, you see people tapping around on their phone, and it can be quite distracting. So I just wondered, when you're thinking about national minimum standards, is that something that you're going to consider as part of those distractions for drivers that can actually impact on passenger safety?
It's particularly an issue because they have to quickly decide if they want that ride or not, and have to keep looking at their phone and swiping to decide whether to take the next ride while they're finishing the ride that, you know, you're in.
I mean, obviously, we know there's a lot of evidence that using a mobile phone whilst you're driving, I mean, obviously, handheld mobile phone, that's clearly illegal. We don't want people to be driving in a distracted fashion. I mean, I'm sure that's always been the case, that you would have radio calls while you were driving. I don't think it's good practice for people to drive and be having conversations on the phone generally, because we know that there's evidence that that's distracting from drivers. I think it's certainly an issue I'd be open to looking at, is how do we protect drivers from distraction whilst they're undertaking the driving task, because that should be their focus, because that's an important safety issue. But that's true for all drivers in all settings, not just taxi drivers.
But you must recognise that there is a difference between the traditional on the radio versus people swiping and audible noise and distraction.
I think they're different. I think both there's potential for both to be distracting, and this isn't just an issue for taxi and private hire drivers, it's also an issue for delivery drivers, I think.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Now, Lawrence.
Thank you. Moving on to safeguarding, Chair, if that's the section you wanted to cover. Yeah. So the Department has stated that the national minimum standards will be focused on safeguarding passengers, and of course, as far away as the J report, it's been said that safeguarding and taxi and private hire is a common thread in a number of very high-profile and horrifying cases. What specific elements is the Department considering when it comes to safeguarding in the new standards?
So I think we would, we want to ensure that when we look at our provisions or our proposals around national minimum standards, I think our starting point is basing on the statutory guidance that the Department already provides, and the best practice guidance. So when it comes to safeguarding, we expect all drivers to have an enhanced disclosure and barring service and bar list checks. I think all drivers should have training in safeguarding. I think those are the important things, so that they're able to play a part in potentially spotting problems. I don't know if there's anything else that we were looking at in relation to that.
I think those two things, I mean, I think they're already pretty widespread actually. All licensing authorities tell us that they do DBS checks, and 96% tell us that they do safeguarding training already. I think the other natural one for us to consider is CCTV.
Yeah.
And that I think is, one of those areas which I'm sure the Minister will come to, where there are some finely balanced arguments, but that is something we want to look at and consider those arguments.
And did the publication of the KC audit last year change the Department's thinking in terms of, or influence Department's thinking in terms of minimum standards?
So I think, obviously I wasn't the Minister responsible for taxi and private hire at that time, but my instinct is that there was already a recognition of the importance of ensuring that safeguarding and was incorporated in our standards. I think Casey gave us further evidence, both and greater impetus to make sure that these things were in place and in a more urgent time frame. But I don't think it fundamentally changed the approach that we were taking. Obviously, over the summer, the Department contacted all licensing authorities to ensure that they were applying the national statutory guidance, and that we were very clear that we would take action against any local authorities who were failing to do so. I think it's just given us the extra kind of support, really, and encouragement to make sure that this happens and happens in a timely fashion.
Yes, and I think it's important that we say that we're talking about a minority of drivers, and that drivers themselves are often at risk of assault and abusive behaviour. And I wanted to ask about particularly vulnerable passengers, including where there's a cross-departmental element to it. I'm thinking particularly about send taxi contracts issued by local authorities, and the quality of those contracts has been an issue in some areas, including in Birmingham. Do you see this, the new standards, as an opportunity for looking at safeguarding in these kinds of areas, and are there discussions at this point between the Department for Transport and Department for Education and other departments that might have an interest?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. Is if and I know there are some of the some operators who particularly focus on providing services for for example, home to school transport, and perhaps you, as a local authority where you're contracting for those sort of services, your specifications might be different. You might not just want a taxi provider. You might want someone who's undertaken specific training around SEND. So I think it's probably so I don't know whether you'd want to incorporate it within the national minimum standards for all taxi and PHV operators, although I can see that there might well be advantages to, and it might be picked up to some degree through mandatory disability equality training. But whether there's a case for having more for all taxi and PHV drivers, or whether local authorities would want to focus that on those who they're contracting with for specifically for that sort of service, I'm kind of in. I don't know whether you have a view, Liz.
Yeah, I mean there are some additional requirements already in that there's a sort of second round of DBS checking, and there's regulated activity, so there are some additional things that are in place, I think, when you're doing SEN driving. In terms of does the department have conversations with DfE? We do. So as part of my broader portfolio, I look at accessibility. So I talk to DfE quite regularly actually about not just taxi and private hire vehicle, but also coach provision and bus provision for that. So we are talking to them about that. I think, as the Minister says, there's a question about what the right mechanism for that and addressing concerns, and whether that is national minimum standards for licensing for everybody, or whether this is a contractual and specific thing that we could look at in detail.
I mean, presumably we would want to avoid a situation where new national minimums are established for commercial drivers, which are then not necessarily reflected in send home to school contracts, unless there's a very specific justification for doing so.
I think if you're licensed as a driver, if you're licensed to, we'll take this away and have a proper look at it, because I think it's a very good point. But I think if you're licensed as a driver, you would have to have as a taxi and PHV driver, you would have to have those requirements anyway, and then it would be what else was additional through the contracts. But we'll absolutely take that away and just check that.
Thank you. And then finally, what is the department's view on the idea of making taxi and private hire driving a regulated activity like nursing or being a paramedic?
I mean, I think that's probably a question that for the Home Office, really, because that sits within their remit. It isn't something unnecessary, and I imagine there are a number of different different job occupations where there would like them to be regulated. It's something I'd be open to considering if that was a recommendation from the committee.
I mean, I think we heard evidence from some of your witnesses that would be a step forward that they'd like to see. I think, as the Minister said, Home Office probably have a lot of people saying that, and we would continue. We have had conversations with them about some of these kinds of things as well. I think it's about the level of discretion that you may or may not want, and I think some evidence was given about from the Institute of Licensing about where actually some of the absolutes that come in once you're on that regulated list, just deciding if that's proportionate and appropriate in this context is the kind of balance of decision making that we would want to work through with the Home Office.
Yes, there's a cost element to it as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Thank you. There's currently no statutory definition of what fit and proper means. What would the department's view be on potentially introducing one for taxi and private hire vehicle drivers?
So I think the current guidance around what's fit and proper is almost like your family your family route. So would you feel confident to put a close someone who's close to you in a car with this person at any time of the day or night, and which is a sort of like easily understandable test, frankly. I think if we I think it's possible to draw up a list of what's fit and proper. I think it's quite difficult for that list to... I think it's quite a difficult list to construct because there'd always be things that you'd miss out. I know, Liz, that's something that we've talked about, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think that's right. It's this point of discretion, and discretion can go two ways in that it can, can be perceived to add risk, but also it can give that discretion to think that that's not on my list, but I'm still not comfortable with it. So I think finding that right balance. I think the national minimum standards will absolutely support this. So what we're looking to do is not necessarily define absolutely, but to give a lot more structure around that decision making. If you don't meet the national minimum standards, you are not a fit and proper person to be able to operate. There will be a level of discretion that sits above that in that kind of definition that the minister's talking about the judgment that you take about whether you're comfortable or not.
And when we were hearing evidence, it did at times seem to me that words were being used interchangeably along the lines of like arrested, charged and convicted. And you could very well therefore have a taxi driver who was arrested for something and a case could take a very, very long time before it got anywhere near charging, and they would entirely lose their livelihood. Do you have any views on that?
I mean, I think that's a really difficult judgment. I mean, I think, I come from the background of having been a trade union official. It's not unusual for someone who is not arrested, obviously, but he could be arrested, but who's facing a serious allegation in a workplace. They'd be suspended, but obviously they'd be suspended on full pay. If a taxi driver has their licence suspended, effectively you're taking away their entire livelihood, and that's the difficult judgment to be made. So I think what our expectation at the moment is that as a taxi licensing authority, you would look at any allegations quickly, but you'd want them to look at it thoroughly before they took that decision to suspend a licence. I think obviously I'm conscious that it's quite possible for taxi drivers and private hire drivers to be susceptible to false allegations as well, because sometimes people are travelling in their vehicle late at night. They could well have had a drink. They might have an argument about the fare. I mean, I can see the possibilities. You want to have a system that protects drivers from unfair allegations, but of course protects the travelling public. And I think speedy decision making is probably the most important, but it isn't an easy judgment. That would be what I would be conscious of. I think there has been a suggestion. I think this may have come up in the committee's discussions in relation to Wolverhampton, which is that they ask someone to surrender their licence when they're facing an allegation, and I was concerned that you wouldn't want someone to be able to surrender their licence as a way of then avoiding ending up being identified on the national NR3S system. I've been assured that if someone surrenders their licence, it doesn't stop the investigation from continuing and the reporting to the NR3S still happening. That's what I would be concerned about. In the same way in a workplace, you wouldn't want someone to be able to resign to avoid getting a disciplinary action case that would disciplinary outcome that would then mean they could just go and work somewhere else without anyone knowing that there'd been a serious concern.
Scott, did you have a supplementary here? Or
very, very briefly, I'm getting nostalgic thinking back to when I was a councillor and I used to sit on the committee which interacted with taxi drivers and PC drivers. And we would get advice from the police on what they felt a fit and proper person was. Do you think council should always follow the advice of police on individuals?
I think in making decisions, you want to have the fullest possible information to help you to make those decisions. Clearly, the police can share information on those who might not have a conviction that would result in them appearing on enhanced and barred lists, but they would be able to share information that might cause you to be able to apply that fit and proper person test. And I think it's really important, and we issued guidance in October of last year to actually strengthen to hopefully improve the guidance and that data sharing that the police do about concerns, precisely in order to allow licensing authorities to make those decisions with more information available to them. I don't know if there's more.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I mean, there is some soft intelligence that can come through the DBS system, and then there is the common law police disclosure engagement. That tends to come when an issue arises and then they are notified rather than at the point of licensing. But I think it is important that within the bounds of the laws that operate around that data sharing, obviously, that data is shared in a timely manner, so that licensing authorities understand what the position is and can take an informed view.
Okay, thank you. Jacob.
Thank you. Minister, in your letter to us, you mentioned in-vehicle CCTV and suggested that might be in scope for the national minimum standards, but you noted that there are concerns within the sector about that, and you've mentioned them today. In principle, does the department think that CCTV should be a national requirement, or should that be left to local discretion?
I mean, I think there's an argument that CCTV should be a national requirement because of the potential safety it provides for passengers, but also the potential safety it provides for drivers as well. However, I know that this is an area that's probably quite contentious. I think that operators are very concerned about what additional cost it brings in, and obviously the impacts that might have on the price and availability of services. There are concerns that people might have about privacy and their right to privacy. There are concerns about how the data, how that data is then stored. I think the Information Commissioner's Office also expressed some concerns in this regard. So I think it's quite a difficult area. It requires quite a lot of careful thought and consideration. However, I can absolutely see that there's an argument for doing it. Certainly is, and I think I met with Rotherham very recently, and I think it's they're one of the 8% of local authorities that do mandate CCTV. I can absolutely see why that's the case, and therefore I think it is worth us considering as part of national minimum standards, and it's something on which I'd very much welcome the committee's view.
So it'll be part of your consultation process, and if it is something that the department decides to go forward with, what support would you put in place for taxi drivers, private hire drivers and operators?
Well, I think that we would have to put some guidance around what the requirements are, particularly in relation to privacy, GDPR, data collection, data storage and retention. I think that those are some of the, I think that's some of the support that would be required. But clearly we'd want to engage with the whole sector about, if we made this a requirement, what other support and guidance would you need to ensure that we're dealing with those issues effectively. And as I say, we haven't reached we don't have a firm position on this. I just think it's something that we absolutely ought to be open to considering.
Thank you. Many of these things we've just been discussing are tools that are used to ensure the safeguarding of passengers. The NR3S is another such tool. Quite a few people have written to and spoken to us about the fact they think that access to that should be opened to operators. Does the department agree?
Yeah, I think in principle we do agree that the operators could helpfully have access to NR3S.
Right. And is that a sort of in theory, in principle, and therefore only in exceptional circumstances, or is there a role for automation in all this, regardless of who's in charge of licensing and enforcement?
Turn to Liz. I know we've talked about this.
We have. So I think there are some constraints about the current NR3S and who and how it can be used, because it was designed for licensing authorities. I think what we do agree with, that there is value in that information being available more broadly. I think that requires some changes, and I know the committee's heard quite a lot about the idea of a national database of drivers, and I think we see that change for operators accessing it as part of that wider change piece, which we are, very interested in doing. So I think, as the Minister says, in principle, we think that the more transparency of information sharing that there can be, the more timely and speedy that can be, with operators being able to directly access that has to be a positive thing. There are some steps we'd need to take to get to that point, but I think that is one of the things we're thinking through in terms of a wider database.
Right, thank you. You had a couple of... You covered... Sterling?
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, fine.
No,
okay,
yeah,
thank you. Back to Jacob again. Thank you.
Well, coming on to that point about the national database, we've heard from people giving evidence that support the establishment of a national database. The local government association is one of those organisations. What's your view on establishing a national database?
So it's something that we're already exploring with a new national licensing database of all licence holders. So potentially that could be used by operators to check the licensing status of drivers and vehicles when they what they use, when they're working with or for the operator. I think we've already got work underway specifically on that. Certainly we had some available funding in the
spending round. We had some funding prioritised for exactly this. So in the coming months we're doing discovery work, and then we've got money available to start actually building a database. So this is absolutely something that we want to explore and are taking active steps to do.
That's helpful. Right, Baggy, got a series of questions.
Enforcement.
Yeah.
So what's the department's assessment of the current effectiveness of enforcement nationally?
So I suspect it's somewhat variable, not least because obviously under the current arrangements the enforcement can only primarily happen on the taxis and PHVs that are licensed by the authority, rather than just licensing in anyone who's operating in the area. I think we heard, certainly when we spoke to Wolverhampton, that they said that they were open to I can't remember the technical word for joint enforcement activities, or allowing other people to enforce on their behalf. I think that's something that in the current setup, where we know that there are lots of taxis that are licensed by Wolverhampton but operating in other areas, that seems to me a good thing. Obviously in the longer term we would hope that wasn't necessary, because we want licensing authorities to be able to enforce on all the taxis and PHVs operating in their area. And that was something that, should we make comprehensive reform, I think greater enforcement powers are an absolute must. That's one of the things that we can't achieve through the changes that we're putting through the English devolution bill, but I think it's one of the things that needs further action, and certainly it's something that the Law Commission had recommended, so that they advised that authorised officers should have the powers to stop and move licensed vehicles, and that they should be able to issue fixed penalty notices. Obviously the problem with the current out of area working, or the people who are licensed away from the area where they're operating, is of course that the money that provides in order to undertake enforcement activities is in the wrong place, and that's fundamentally the issue that we need to try to address.
Okay, in the department's written evidence, it was stated that the national minimum standards, to be effective, they would need to be accompanied by appropriate enforcement mechanisms. What did you have in mind in that?
Some of the things the Minister's just talked about. So these powers to be able to enforce against drivers in your area who you've not licensed, potential for fixed penalty notices for sort of more minor breaches of licence, which then could, if it was ring fenced, go back into improving the kind of financing of licensing more broadly. I think that power to stop a vehicle without a police officer there. Those kind of things are the kind of things that we are thinking about. And we also hope that if they come alongside national minimum standards, actually, because the standards will be more consistent, actually it makes it easier for one licensing authority area to enforce against another, because there's a commonality of standards, what you're enforcing against. So I think those two things could work well together.
Okay, so resources you touched on being a big challenge. and resource in the right place to make sure enforcement's effective. Wolverhampton, going back to our friends in Wolverhampton for a second again, I mean, they've built up a huge surplus with the fees that they've been getting. They could probably tackle that resource issue by taking on more enforcement officers and sending them around.
Well, and I think they already do that. Precisely for those reasons.
They have offices in other parts of the country where they've got enforcement.
They could do a lot more, because
there's always a
other operators or other authorities will say they don't see enough of their enforcement officers, yet they've got lots of drivers licensed in Wolverhampton.
Absolutely,
or from Wolverhampton.
I think it just underlines that we've ended up with a situation that that isn't the right outcome that we want, is it? In the short term, absolutely, and I know Wolverhampton have talked about putting more resources, certainly in our conversations with them, into enforcement in other areas, but it does highlight precisely why we want people to be licensed local to where they're working, so that the resources for enforcement match the drivers who are actually operating in the area.
Does the department have a plan on how this can be tackled going forward?
So I think it comes back to the question of how what's the best setup in a more comprehensive reform of the regulations to tackle those issues. As Liz suggested, is requiring someone to license close to where they work might avoid some of the pitfalls of trying to tackle out of area working through the ABBA model. But I'm very open to. I haven't reached a fixed view. We know that we need to do it. We know what we want the outcomes to be. We haven't reached a fixed view on what's the best way of getting there. And actually, I kind of want to bring together interested parties to build consensus. Obviously, that's kind of what you've done, and you'll bring your recommendations. And I think that's a really important part of the process. But certainly, we've got plans in this spring to convene some roundtables to look at what might be the best mechanisms for tackling precisely these issues.
Okay, and then just finally, some of the work around setting national standards, also national baselines for enforcement standards as well, and requirements. So things like data sharing, joint operations, public reporting, access to data, are they the sort of things that are being looked at?
I think that's precisely the sorts of things that we are considering. I don't know, Liz, if you want to... I've missed something.
I think the first thing we're looking at through national minimum standards is around the drivers and the safety of the drivers, as you would expect. I think, but as part of that and as part of the powers that we're taking, we do have the capacity and capability to look at other things around the operator data sharing and all of those kind of things. And they are other things we want to consider, whether that's through national minimum standards themselves or through other mechanisms. I think is something we want to work through. But those kind of expectations are absolutely the kind of things that we're thinking about.
And another aspect on baseline would be the turnaround time, because certainly many of us have had constituents who are sitting waiting for a decision. Meanwhile, they can't earn money or look to go for another career if they are going to be struck off. There's another aspect to enforcement and licensing, particularly relicensing. So in London, we have the TfL, the regional authority, makes the decisions and has its own internal processes, which are transparent. There is no councillor involvement, as issue we've covered before. It has been suggested to us that where councillors sitting on licensing committees have a role, they can or could potentially come up with perverse decisions as to who should or shouldn't be a driver or an operator. So going to a regional LTA model, will the role of councillors in that process be considered as part of that?
It's certainly a conversation and a discussion I had with the Institute of Licensing, and I'm sure you heard that in there. I suppose what we want to do is to make sure that there is consistent decision making in line with the national minimum standards and the licensing authority's own policy. I think I think my view would be that the role of the democratically elected councillors is to set out policy, not necessarily to, be responsible for the application of it. But the important bit is that whoever's making decisions, whether it is officers or whether it's a licensing committee, is that we give them the structure to make good decisions that are in line with the national minimum standards and the policy they themselves have set out.
Thank you. Right, now cross-border enforcement. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Our inquiry has led us to understand that there's currently some scope for joint enforcement between licensing authorities where there is agreement between them. But does the department support going further and giving licensing authorities the statutory power to investigate and enforce against any taxi or PHV driver or vehicle operating in their area, regardless of which authority issued the licence? Because that might be one way of dealing with this whole, well, I'm tempted to call it the Wolverhampton problem, but I might get in trouble. Well, I've done it now anyway.
I think the answer is yes, and I think that was what we were saying in response to Baggy, which is we do think that is something that the Law Commission set out, and I think that's something we would want to address in a more comprehensive reform of the regulations.
And do you think that there might be additional resources or support that would be necessary to improve that capacity?
Yeah, and I think that was the point I was getting at, really, which is that if you end up with a lot of out of area licensing, then it means that the resources are not in the right place, and so we need to come up with a solution that deals with that.
Do you see any other barriers beyond the funds or resources to prevent that more joined up enforcement?
I think differing standards, because you have to be clear what you're enforcing against. So I think the more consistent the standards, the easier it is to have joint enforcement and nationalised enforcement. And I think, even in a world where there are journey restrictions in place, people can still legitimately drive into another licensing authority area as long as they're coming back, and that could be quite a long way away. And so, there will always be this issue where standards are very different on, even if you had the powers to enforce, or you clear what you're enforcing against, you understand that. And so I think the more consistent those standards are, the easier it becomes for anyone to enforce against anybody else, regardless of where we get to on out of the area working.
Thank you. Just briefly to bring that back to my earlier question about a national licensing standard, if enforcement is done locally, and therefore, it's down to the driver to enter into other jurisdictions or other areas of enforcement, but also incumbent on them to know the rules. We've got data, technology, geofencing, which allows individual pieces of transport furniture to be allowed in some zones and not just yards further down the road. It's quite precise and articulate. And again, I would sort of ask whether there's any further appetite in that context of possibly local enforcement to look at a national licensing system and apply the technology solution more to the local enforcement.
So obviously for drivers, I mean, their requirement, that they've got requirements on them with the area where they've licensed. Yeah. But you can always drive to areas outside your own, where you're licensed, for the reason that Liz just said. So you might be doing a pickup from, it might be licensed in Nottingham, but doing a pickup from Heathrow Airport, or driving someone to, the far end of the country, particularly in, some sort of executive driving. So you're not required to, obviously you're required to, comply with the rules of the road and any kind of road signage and the rest of it, but you wouldn't necessarily need to know what the licensing requirement was in another area. I might be missing your point.
Well, would there not be an advantage? Because some of the problems that we've heard from local areas are really down to quite local specific circumstances. Like, it's quite useful to be able to call on a larger region of private hire vehicles if there's a big event, for instance, but then again, swarming and clustering around what are not big events but opportunity hotspots is probably where we've led to issues of drivers sleeping in their cars. So to be able to carry out some of that stuff on a very local basis might be an advantage to local enforcement authorities.
I'm trying to think what that would look like.
So in your question, are you talking about kind of how the enforcement would work in those particular areas, or restricting, or the rules that the driver face depending on where they go? I'm sorry, I'm probably
no, that's fine. Let's imagine that the local job is enforcement, more about enforcement, less about licensing.
Okay.
the enforcement authority could then potentially say, right, we're actually going to put a red zone around this area here.
I see.
Which means no taxis are allowed there without a pre-booked job at all. So you just can't go in there with a private hire vehicle, not taxi. Yeah. Just for instance, which would be a really articulate way of solving a particular problem in a particular area.
Yeah. So particularly thinking about things like airports, where we heard evidence of people, just being in the area and waiting for a job.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, those are kind of things that we could think about. I mean, the risk in all those things is that you just displace the problem and people hover on the outside of it, don't you?
Of course,
I think these are the kind of things that we would need to work through. But I think there is something to be considered locally, particularly around those areas where there might be disadvantages to local people as well as the trade in having people circling around. We don't want lots of empty miles. I think that's one of the things that we're really considering, and we need to think about all the options for how you avoid that.
Thank you. Sorry for the long-winded question.
No. I was trying to make sure.
I mean, that last issue is a major issue around Heathrow Airport. I mean, when the relaxation of out-of-area working came in with the regs in 2015, at that point, apps were not in major use. Now we have apps, so presumably it would be much easier nowadays to be able to flag up. I mean, the queuing at the airport or stations or whatever would have to deal with this, but it would be possible to get an ABBA pickup now because one could specify that through the apps process. So, I don't know, Nottingham to Birmingham Airport, the Nottingham driver could probably flag up to passengers at Birmingham Airport, anyone wanting to go to Nottingham to, I mean, the technology's there, surely.
I mean, I think, obviously, where you are serving a popular destination where there's likely to be people who are coming in the opposite direction, the apps make it more likely that you'd be able to find a fare. But that isn't always going to be the case.
Yeah.
I don't know, Liz.
I think kind of when the changes happened in 2015, I think out of area working was always possible, but has increased and has increased even more because of the app-based technology. I don't think it was necessarily just the 2015 Act that facilitated that. I think you're right. Certainly on the big kind of set piece places like airports. I think the ABBA model, the issue we think about more is things, like on boundary areas, local journeys. Someone's going to a supermarket that's a mile and a half over a boundary, and then they want to go on to somewhere else and they can't. Those things are harder to, I think, manage around than perhaps the airports.
Yeah. But I think technology has changed things in the 11 years since then. Okay, we're now going to move on to accessibility. Baggy.
Chair. What's the department's view of the current effectiveness of enforcement around accessibility legislation and duties?
I mean, obviously, we want local authorities to enforce where legislation is not being complied with. Frankly, the statistics that we see and the anecdotal evidence we have from, for example, from guide dog users about the number of refusals that they get is frankly appalling. So we've got to assume that enforcement isn't working as well as it should do, because people shouldn't be having those unacceptable experiences.
Just taking the guide dogs issue and the refusal there, what's the plan to improve or make improvements in that area?
I think that, we want licensing authorities to be making sure that they are enforcing around that, and that they're making it as easy as possible for people to report when those problems happen. And obviously I don't think it should be entirely down to disable people to have to do that reporting. I can't remember the technical word for it, but mystery shoppers, local authorities can deploy that to find where there are problems in existence, and I think they should take action against drivers and operators who are not complying with the law. It's just simply unacceptable that disabled people are experiencing discrimination when they're trying to use an important form of transport.
I'd just add to what Minister said. I think this is one of the reasons we want disability equality training to be mandated through national minimum standards, because when we're only seeing something like 2/3 of people mandating that training, it may be that some drivers just don't know because they haven't had the training, and that's why the training is so important, so that people do know, so that hopefully what we want to see is a reduction in the refusals, and part of that is knowledge and part of that is enforcement.
I think covered the final question there in the minimum standards around
I think we've covered
disability.
That. Okay, Scott.
So we heard from Transport for All about concerns they have about accessing wheelchair accessible vehicles, and I think Lawrence mentioned that Wolverhampton and its gigantic licensing database, wheelchair accessible vehicles are underrepresented there. And when we had the app operators in, they seemed a little bit passive about the whole situation. This is a market failure, isn't it? And it's maybe time for the government to act.
I mean, I think so. Obviously, we want there to be sufficient wheelchair accessible vehicles that serve the needs of disabled people for whom that's what they want. And I think it's fair to just to highlight the fact that wheelchair accessible vehicles are not necessarily the best accessible vehicles for all disabled people, because the higher step in and quite a large area in the cab, it's not necessarily great for someone who's visually impaired or whatever. But we do want there to be sufficient wheelchair accessible vehicles. Making that happen is what is slightly more difficult. Now, obviously, there are some local authorities that require their entire taxi fleet to be wheelchair accessible, but that might not be necessary or able to be provided everywhere. We know that wheelchair accessible vehicles are expensive to provide. I think in some places, if you put in a requirement that you wanted a certain proportion of your taxis to be wheelchair accessible and that you wouldn't license a vehicle if it wasn't wheelchair accessible, I think the worry is that might displace people to decide, well, I'm not going to drive a taxi, I'm going to change to driving a PHV, for example. So I think it's finding what are the right mechanisms. It's probably a bit of a mixture of carrot and stick to try to ensure that licensing authorities are able to get the level of wheelchair accessible vehicles that they need in order to meet demand. But I'm not sure that there's a really easy way
Costs are a bit of a red herring, though, aren't they? Because in a building like this we have ramps and elevators, because we accept that we want to spend a little bit more to create that more equal society.
Sorry, I wasn't suggesting
of course, I know,
we didn't think there was it was worthwhile. What I was suggesting But it requires people to come forward wanting to license their wheelchair, to purchase a wheelchair accessible vehicle and to operate it. And so I think that's
when we had Uber in Bolton, they must have thousands and thousands of vehicles across the UK. Lawrence talked about the number of vehicles in Wolverhampton where wheelchair accessible vehicles are underrepresented. There's more licence authorities can do, and perhaps through minimum standards, to ensure that a proportion of their taxi and private hire car fleet are wheelchair accessible. So when someone does call for one, it's there, and they can use it rather than having to plan trips days in advance. It's about creating that more equal country, and there is more the government could do. Because it seems, I didn't get the feeling that Uber and Bolt were going to act in this area without guidance or perhaps something a bit firmer from the government.
Well, certainly I would want there to be sufficient provision to meet need. I don't want people to be in a position where they can't access a vehicle that meets their needs and enables them to do the journeys they want to do. So I'm very, I don't know if Liz, you've got anything to add, but I'd be very happy to look further at that issue and what action we could take to ensure that that we tackle that challenge, albeit I think it might bring its own challenges.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the problem is most acute in private hire vehicles, where there is a much lower percentage of them, and I think it's probably felt most acutely therefore in more rural areas. I think urban areas are probably better served through taxi fleets on this. What the mechanisms are, it's complicated and tricky, because there is the opportunity for people for licensing authorities to think about setting minimum percentages, but if you're not meeting that, does that kind of stop you being able to have any more private hire vehicles? Could that disproportionately other disabled people. I think there are lots of things to be weighed up, but I think, as the Minister said, we're happy to take away and think, more we can do and how we can work with others. I think that the makeup of the market is difficult because a lot of the drivers own their own vehicles and work for multiple platforms. So whilst I don't think that means that operators have no role in it, I think it's more complicated than it might be if everyone was employed directly by a single operator.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, some of these operators are exploiting the way the legislation works. And people who require wheelchair accessible vehicles, they're paying the price for that. And this drive to completely drive down costs all the time, people with disabilities are paying the price. And like I was saying earlier, I think most people are willing to pay a little bit extra for a fleet that is better for their community as a whole. So it's good that you've committed to looking at this. That's good. Thank you.
I mean, I actually take issue about that because, I think it's it's understood that disabled people should not have to pay more for service.
People as a whole.
I see. Right. Yeah. Because I think the challenge is it comes down to the driver owner or the operator who's going to have to pay the costs of a wheelchair accessible vehicle, because just enforcing or requiring operators, it isn't going to magic more wheelchair accessible vehicles. And we know from London where black cabs are required to be wheelchair accessible, and EVs as well, and they are more expensive, I think 60, 70, 80,000 if not more, whereas obviously a saloon car is a lot cheaper. And what's happening in London is there's no, there doesn't appear to be any cut in the number of PHVs, but we're seeing a decline in the number of black cabs. It's basic economics. So I'm just asking, given the importance of accessibility, will the department look at other methods to find a way that this cost differential to provide an essential, accessible transport mechanism for people who probably can't use other forms of public transport can be explored? Because personally, I don't think the enforcement mechanism is going to deliver that.
Well, certainly, I'm very happy that we look at that. I think we share the aspiration very much that we want to ensure that disabled people have the opportunities that they need, including wheelchair users, absolutely. And we'll take that away and look at what more we might do and what the options might be.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay, now we're moving on to information sharing and complaints. Jacob.
Thank you. Just on information sharing between the police and licensing authorities, we've heard that it's very different across the country and it's dependent on the relationship and agreements that licensing authorities have with the police force in their area, and there's no official role for the police in the licensing of taxi or private hired drivers. We've heard from the Institute of Licensing that there's been serious cases where relevant information hasn't been available to licensing authorities because of concerns and restrictions on the data sharing agreement. So does the department believe that this kind of information should be put onto a statutory footing? Information sharing should be on a statutory footing with a clear duty to provide that relevant information within set timescales?
I mean, at the moment, the police do have the ability under the common law police disclosure powers to inform licensing authorities of relevant information when there is an urgent and pressing need. As part of our look at reforming the sector, we will look at how relevant information is shared with those that need it, and that would include the information that's on the existing database, but also information on current licences in respect of PHV vehicles and operators too. And it might be useful for the information held by DVLA should be shared proactively with licensing authorities when that relates to drivers or vehicles. It sounds like what you're suggesting might require me to have conversations with my colleagues in the Home Office around what would be required. But we do want to ensure that when licensing authorities are making their decisions, they have the information that they need to make effective decisions that are in the interests of passengers and keeping them safe. So if there's more that we can do, I'm very open to looking at that. Liz, I don't know if that's something you can talk about, because you've probably had those conversations with colleagues in Home Office.
Yeah, we have talked to the Home Office, and we issued guidance in October last year to try and clarify some of this. The information sharing under common law police disclosure is obviously far broader than taxi and PHV drivers, and it is sort of set. There is legislation around what can and can't be shared. I think with all things there is interpretations about how much information can share, and the judgment about whether there's pressing social need and all of those things is made by individuals. And I think the more guidance and clarity that there is about that, the more helpful it becomes. I think it's important to remember as well that an issue could happen. A driver in their normal life could be arrested for something in a totally different part of the country to where they live, to where they work, to where they're licensed. And so there needs to be, the more consistency there is about how information is shared, the better. I think a national database would also be helpful, because one of the things for police when they make an arrest is they ask the question about whether, what's your job? And it's individual will say or not say if they're a taxi driver. If there is a list of all of the drivers there and available, I think that would help just to trigger that start of the process to realise that this is definitely a taxi driver. It's been checked. We know therefore that there is something to share with a licensing authority. They'll be able to see where they're licensed as well. So I think the database will have a really important role to play in sort of facilitating this.
So you see this as part of that national database?
Yeah.
That
I think it would help. I don't think it's a panacea. I think that judgment, individual judgment about what constitutes a pressing social need is something. But I think just that knowing that someone is a taxi driver is the first kind of hurdle to get over, to know that you might need to share information.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. Do you envisage that the national minimum standards will include measures to change or improve the complaints process?
Well, I think we're already want local authorities to make it absolutely clear how someone can make a complaint, and that should be clear on the local authority website. They could also require there to be information in vehicles that explains how you can make a complaint. I think, obviously we talked earlier in the committee around CCTV, which obviously can provide really valuable evidence in the case of complaints. I think I'm not sure that there's more that we think is necessary, but But if you think there are other things that we should be doing, obviously it's also a question about what local authorities, licensing authorities, do with the information that they get. And I think where they see a pattern of complaints about a particular driver or operator, obviously we want them to be following that up and providing, looking at what's happening. That might want to be a requirement for there to be further training, or in some cases it might be that they review the licence in total or take other enforcement action.
So do you think it is clear for passengers at the moment who have to go away and work out which council website they want to look at, or possibly search for a little sticker in the taxi? Because we've heard examples and evidence, for example, that perhaps it'd be better if there was a national complaints portal, so it was very clear wherever you caught a taxi or got a private hire vehicle in the country, you can complain in the same place, and then it is filtered down to the right person.
I hadn't considered setting up a national complaints portal. I do think the underlying point is absolutely right, which is that if you, obviously we hope most people using taxis won't have any reason to complain, but if there is a problem, that you should know where to complain to. I'm guessing in lots of cases people's first port of call, particularly for PHVs, will be the operator. For taxis, probably it might be the local authority. It should be really clear to people where they make that complaint to, and if we need to strengthen things to ensure that people know where to make a complaint to and that it's dealt with appropriately, then absolutely we'll look at that.
Yeah, for your average constituent, it's clearly not something you do very often. Hopefully never at all. So actually, perhaps And do they know which council it is, particularly if it's sort of near a border? So moving on from that, in your written evidence, you said that you were aware anecdotally of large operators refusing to provide a driver's PHV licence number after discrimination complaints. What do you think could stop this from happening?
Well, I think we need to look at how that can be dealt with, because what I wouldn't want, and I think the example that was given to me was that it was, where someone had made a booking and then the booking was cancelled, and whereas they could have had the information about which driver it was and what their licence number was at the time of making the booking, is that once the booking had been cancelled by the driver, that information disappeared. And I think that's something that we need to look at how we would, because what I don't want is a position where, someone is left without a form of redress and without being able to make that complaint in an effective way. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, and I think the examples we've had are things like refusal to take an assistance dog, journeys cancelled, then it's too late at that point to then know what the licence number is and to formalise that complaint. And that's not something we would obviously want to see happening, and what mechanisms we would need to take to sort of improve that transparency. Not all roads lead back to the database, but I think if there is more information readily available on drivers on a database, that might help with that. So that's something else we would want to consider.
We've touched on this already, but would you envisage standards having expectations for how quickly licences can be suspended or revoked in a fair manner? Both driver and passenger.
Yeah, so I think, obviously all complaint processes, you want them to be dealt with in a prompt fashion. I'm just trying to wonder where we would put that into, whether we've got anything in our guidance at the moment.
I think there is. We should think about it. It might be appropriate for it to be in national minimum standards. It might be appropriate for it to be through some other mechanism. I think being clear on our expectations about how quickly decisions are made, as you say, is a good thing for drivers. It's a good thing for passengers. When you become overly absolute, there might be difficult questions that need to be looked at, and we wouldn't want to kind of not allow for proper investigation. But I think there are standards we want people to see, to not leaving things for long periods not being addressed.
And then finally, does the department think there's any merit in giving independent oversight of the taxi and PHV complaints process? For example, we have traffic commissioners who are rather good at kind of licensing and that kind of thing. Has any consideration been given to giving them some powers in this regard?
I think there is an argument for independent oversight. I think it would be quite a change for traffic commissioners in terms of their current role, but looking at that issue around independent oversight and considering where might the best place for that sit. I think I'd be open-minded to look at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Thank you. Right. Sorry. Thank you, colleagues. If there's no other questions from other colleagues, I've got a couple. So obviously we're looking forward to seeing the integrated transport strategy in due course. Any timing?
Of course.
So what can we expect that strategy to say about taxis and private hire vehicles and integration into local transport networks?
Well, obviously I don't want to preempt the launch of the integrated national transport strategy, but I think we recognise the importance that taxis and private hire vehicles play, particularly at certain times of day, particularly as part of that kind of as part of integrated journeys. Actually, often a lot of time people are using taxis and private hire for those kind of home to maybe some of those last mile bits, or from home to to railway stations or whatever. So I think, and part of our thinking around moving licensing to transport authority level is around strengthening that ability to see taxi and private hire as part of a wider transport system in the area. So I think they're a really important part of the mix, and they're really important for particular segments of the population, and we want to recognise that.
Okay, because I think there's opportunities both in planning and design, say, of stations and airports, but also I've seen in other jurisdictions where there's been a distinct area for Uber and app-based cabs, because at the moment we seem to only allow some kind of vehicles to pick up and drop off at stations, but not private hire vehicles, and this seems so. I'm hoping that can be included when you're looking at that work. Okay, so thank you for that. The final question is: I know that the timing of the English Devo bill is not in your gift, Minister, but once that does get royal assent, what sort of timescale are you looking at for a consultation and then any regulation or primary legislation changes?
Well, obviously, in terms
in
of
this area,
national
minimum standards.
In terms of national minimum standards and the then, obviously the English Devolution Bill would give us those powers. Part of the very reason for seeking to use the English Devolution Bill is in order that we could act promptly on the issues that Baroness Casey raised with us. So without having had this discussion with Liz about what the resources available in the team and how quickly we could move, I think we would want to get this work underway of a consultation on what those national minimum standards comprise. But we've already got work planned for this spring, looking at the whole broader issues around taxi and private hire regulation, and trying to kind of come up with to build a consensus about what ways would we deal with the very issues that you as a committee have been contemplating over the space of this inquiry. And that's because we recognise that there is that this issue has been knocking around for a number of years now. It's time that there was action, and we're keen to do that. That we're not delaying.
Yeah, no, I think you've got current consultation going on in terms of the nature of the local authority, what tier of local authority.
Yeah, and that will close.
And that closes in April.
Probably the early April, yeah.
I think what most people want in the sector and using the sector want to know is, when will it be actually different? How many years do they have to wait?
Well, hopefully not very many.
Okay. Thank you, Minister, for your evidence today. I should have thanked you also for the letter to us on the changes that the government proposes to bring in. And do feel free to write to us if there's anything you feel you want to flesh out on in terms of the questions today, or anything else you feel that you wanted to answer and we didn't ask. We know that you've opened a consultation on some of the issues, and I know that you will consider the evidence that we've gathered in this inquiry when you're considering next steps. And obviously, as you know, we expect to make our recommendations to you in due course. That concludes today's session. Order.